Elizabeth Stride, also known as Long Liz, was the third of the canonical five. She was found on the 30th of September 1888 at approximately 1 a.m. by Louis Deemschutz at the entrance to Dutfield's yard. Deemschutz believed that she was either drunk or sleeping, but when he and two other men tried to rouse her, they realised that she was dead. Elizabeth wasn't native to London or even to the UK, she was from Sweden. So how did Elizabeth Stride come to be in Dutfield's yard that morning? Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustavsdotter on the family farm in Torslanda near Gothenburg, Sweden on the 27th of November 1843. She was the second child of Gustaf Eriksson and Beata Karlsdotter. In October 1860, as her older sister had before her, and as was tradition at the time, she moved to the city of Gothenburg, where she began work as a domestic servant in the home of Lars Olsson and his family in the district of Majorna. It's not certain what happened in this post, but by March 1865, Elizabeth was registered as a prostitute. This was required by law, and registered prostitutes were required to submit to weekly inspections with the aim of preventing venereal disease, in particular syphilis, which was very much feared at the time. Now, I obtained a lot of information about Elizabeth from the book The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. That details that at the time there were two registers where prostitutes were required to be recorded. One was for open prostitutes, but the other was for women who we wouldn't consider to be prostitutes, sex workers today. And that register was for women who led immoral lives, such as living with a man who she wasn't married to, or being pregnant when she wasn't married. Apparently, it didn't matter. They were all treated the same. And at the time that Elizabeth was registered, she wasn't married, but she was obviously pregnant. In April 1865, Elizabeth was sent to hospital for venereal disease, presumably after presenting with symptoms at one of her weekly examinations. And there was no cure for syphilis at that time. Antibiotics wouldn't be invented for another 60 years in 1928. There were treatments, but remember, modern medicine was in its infancy. These treatments were horrible and dangerous. For example, ingesting mercury, which we all know now is poison. Any physical signs of the disease, such as the characteristic cankers or sores, were either cut off or burned, which in itself carried a risk with no antibiotics to treat the resultant wound. And it's believed that these treatments caused Elizabeth to go into premature labour, and on the 21st of April 1865, at only 7 months gestation, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter. She was released from hospital on the 13th of May, though she was still required to submit to the weekly examinations. In August, she was returned to the hospital for further treatment, and then again on the 17th of October. In November 1865, she was removed from the register, and I believe that this is because she returned working in domestic service, this time for a Carl and Maria Weisner at number 27 Hesartigen. I hope I said that right. So this does suggest, doesn't it, that Elizabeth was on that second register, not the one for the open prostitutes, but she was probably on there because she'd been dobbed in because she was pregnant and not married. Elizabeth was described as being quiet, pretty, shy, kind, with blue eyes, dark hair and a slender build, and standing 5'2". In February 1866, Elizabeth boarded a ship to London to begin a new life as a domestic servant for a wealthy family in Hyde Park. And on her arrival in London, Elizabeth learned to speak both English and Yiddish. Remember, there was quite a big Jewish community in London at the time. So Elizabeth was probably pretty clever, right? It's difficult to learn a second language, let alone a third. It's unknown why, but Elizabeth's employment in Hyde Park came to an end, and by 1869 she was working for an Elizabeth Bond, who was a widow, who ran a respectable boarding house, and she had also met and become engaged to a man by the name of John Stride. And John was a carpenter. Elizabeth and John were married on the 7th of March 1869, and this is how she became Elizabeth Stride. And this is also how she came to have the nickname Long Liz. Not because she was tall, remember she was 5'2", but because long was a nickname for people named Stride, as in a long step. Sadly, the marriage would produce no children, and I do wonder if that was anything to do with the treatment that she had had, or perhaps it was a complication of the disease itself. The couple moved to Poplar Newtown, and they opened a coffee shop on Upper North Street. However, the business didn't thrive as they had hoped, and they moved the business to 178 Poplar Street in 1871. Unfortunately, this business also failed, and it was taken over by a John Dale in 1875. So I've heard that coffee shops at that time were often a front for brothels, and there's no evidence to support that this is the case with John and Elizabeth's shop. I just wanted to point that out as a possibility. I think it's probably more the case that it was difficult for coffee shops to thrive because they were in direct competition with pubs. By 1881, it appears that Elizabeth and John had split because she was registered as being at the Whitechapel infirmary for treatment of bronchitis from the 28th of December until the 4th of January the following year. And from there, she lodged on and off at a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street. In 1885, Elizabeth began a relationship with a Michael Kidney, and Michael Kidney was a labourer and 7 years her junior. They lived at 35 and then 36 Devonshire Street, and by August 1888 they were living in Dorset Street, and remember, that was described as the worst street in London. And Kidney would later describe the relationship as stormy, owing to Elizabeth's drinking. And the two often quarrelled and split, only for Elizabeth to return to him a few days later. And this account is supported by various addresses that Elizabeth was registered at from time to time. In May 1886, Elizabeth received assistance from the Swedish Church on 2 occasions, given her address as Devonshire Street. And it could be when the story of Elizabeth losing 2 of her 9 children and a husband was first told. Elizabeth claimed that her husband and 2 children had drowned when the SS Princess Alice, a passenger ship which travelled along the Thames from the London Bridge to Sheerness, Kent, had sunk in the River Thames in September 1878 when it took a wrong sailing line and was struck by another vessel, causing it to break in two and sink. The majority of the passengers had drowned, and Elizabeth's story is that she survived by climbing the ship's mast, and that as she had done so, she was kicked in the face by a man, damaging her jaw and causing her to have a permanent stammer. I'm not sure whether she had a stammer or not. There was no such deformity found years later when her post-mortem was carried out. She told several people this story though, and it's not known why, but the Princess Alice disaster was well known, and it's likely that a story along those lines would make those at the Swedish Church sympathetic and more likely to give her assistance. So this may have been the reason for that tall tale. In 1887, Elizabeth was registered as an inmate at the Poplar Workhouse, suggesting that she really had fallen on hard times. Remember, the workhouse was a horrible place, dreaded, feared by the poor, and avoided as much as possible. It appears that she had left, though, by the following month, and there's also records reflecting that at that time she had charged Michael Kidney with assault. However, the case was dropped when she didn't turn up at the magistrate's court. It's not known why. Maybe they'd reconciled. In July 1888 and September 1888, she again received assistance from the Swedish Church. Elizabeth returned to the lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street in late September 1888 after again quarrelling with Michael Kidney. During this day, she spoke with Dr. Thomas Bernardo, who had visited the lodging house when canvassing opinion on a housing scheme for children. He would go on to say afterwards that he recognised Elizabeth as one of the women that he had spoken to at the lodging house, and the women there were thoroughly frightened of the murders that were going on. At 6:30 p.m. on the 29th of September 1888, Elizabeth Tanner saw Elizabeth in the Queen's Head public house. They drank together and then walked back to the lodging house. Between 7 and 8 p.m, Elizabeth was seen leaving the lodging house again. At 11 p.m, 2 men went to the Bricklayers Arms pub on Settle Street, and they say that at the same time they entered, they saw Elizabeth leaving with a man who they describe as short, with sandy eyelashes, a morning suit and coat, and a billycock hat. And they said that it was raining, and not wanting to go out in the rain, Elizabeth and this man stood in the doorway where they were kissing and cuddling, and someone in the pub shouted to Elizabeth saying that the man she was with was Leather Apron, and Leather Apron was the press's favourite subject at the time. After this, Elizabeth and the man left. At 11:45, Elizabeth was seen by William Marshall standing in the doorway of 64 Burner Street, talking to a man with a black cutaway coat and a sailor's hat. And he said that the man said to her, "You would say anything but your prayers." That sounds pretty creepy, doesn't it? Maybe it was flirty talk for the time, but it gives me the ick. It sounds like that wasn't the guy anyway, because Elizabeth was seen again by a policeman, William Smith, at 12:35 a.m. with a young man on Burner Street opposite the Working Man's Educational Club. He described this man as being around 28 years of age, wearing a dark coat and a deerstalker hat, and carrying a parcel wrapped in newspaper approximately 6 inches by 18 inches. An entry in the Home Office file states that she was seen again at 12:45 a.m, so about 10 minutes later, and that entry read, "Israel Swartz of 22 Helen Street, Backchurch Lane, stated that at this hour, turning into Burner Street from Commercial Road and having gotten as far as the gateway where the murder was committed, he saw a man stop and speak to a woman who was standing in the gateway. He tried to pull the woman into the street, but he turned her round and threw her down on the footway, and the woman screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. On crossing to the opposite side of the street, he saw a second man lighting his pipe. The man who threw the woman down called out, apparently to the man on the opposite side of the road, 'Lipsky,' and then Swartz walked away, but finding that he was followed by the second man, he ran as far as the railway arch, but the man did not follow so far." And Elizabeth was found by Louis Deemschutz only 15 minutes later. Elizabeth's possessions were a long black cloth jacket, trimmed with fur at the bottom, with a red rose and white maidenhair fern pinned to it, a black skirt, a black crepe bonnet, a checked neck scarf knotted on the left side, a dark brown velveteen bodice, 2 light serge petticoats, 1 white chemise, white stockings, spring-sided boots, 2 handkerchiefs, a thimble, a key, a piece of wool wrapped around a piece of card, a small piece of lead pencil, 6 large buttons and 1 small button, a comb, a broken piece of comb, a metal spoon, a dress hook, a piece of muslin, and 1 or 2 pieces of paper. And remember, these were her worldly possessions. Like the other women, she was homeless at the time, even staying in a lodging house. There wouldn't have been anywhere to put her possessions, so she carried everything that she owned with her. Elizabeth was laid to rest at the East London Cemetery Company Limited, Plaidstow, London, grave 15509, square 37. In the next video, I'll begin speaking about Jack the Ripper's suspects, beginning with James Maybrick, a Liverpudlian cotton merchant put forward as a suspect in the early 90s, following the publication of a confessional diary and a pocket watch with the victim's names scratched inside the case. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.